The Secret Service agents scanned the mass of humanity that seemed to be closing in like a giant swarm. They looked at hands and faces for quick movements or quizzical looks, anything that seemed out of place. Their eyes gazed across the sea of people on the ground and up to the open windows in the buildings surrounding the lot. In the midst of the mayhem, the agents were calm, but ready to react in a millisecond if anything got out of hand. Hello and welcome back to my channel. I'm Jess, Connell, and if you're new, then welcome. I hope to earn your subscription today. We are in part 14 of our walk through the JFK assassination through literature. And what we are doing is every beat of the story, we are using a different piece of Kennedy literature to tell that part so that as learners, we can get familiarized with a variety of books about the topic and also hopefully begin to see patterns that emerge across many different books. By doing so, we don't isolate ourselves into one particular perspective or one person's set of research, but hopefully over the books that we read, we will each come away with a little bit more certainty of where we can step with solid confidence about where the facts lie. This is such a tricky case, and the deeper I get into it, the more I feel that trickiness. I understand, one of the first books I read, I don't even know if I still own it, I'm sure I do, but I think it's called like the JFK assassination debates. And I remember it was, like I said, it was probably one of the first 2 or 3 books I read about the topic, and it was about 20 years ago. But I remember walking away with, okay, every chapter, this one was one that presented like, here's the Cuban angle, here's the mafia angle, here's the government angle, here's the Russians angle. And each one I remember thinking like, I could see that. I could see that. I could see that one. I could see this one. And so it is a case where there are obviously a variety of people who all have motives to kill a president. And so, as we go through the case, we are looking for where can we step with certainty so that we don't get off into the weeds in a tangent following one person's train of thought, but instead can just familiarize ourselves with the basic facts. So today we are looking at a book called The Kennedy Detail by Gerald Blaine. It says JFK's Secret Service agents break their silence. And this book, I love actually the cover. I'm just going to let you guys enjoy that for a minute. How they colorized JFK and Jackie and their agents there in the sea of the black and white photo. So just kind of nice. I see Clint Hill right here. He was Mrs. Kennedy's particular Secret Service agent, but there's others all around the president and just guarding and watching. I always find it fascinating, I don't know if you do, to watch Secret Service agents move through a crowd, or even like if I'm watching William and Catherine as they move through a crowd, you can see the security agents, and what they're doing is not paying attention to the principals. They are paying attention to anyone in the crowd. They're scanning, they're watching, they're looking for anything out of the ordinary. They're scanning for odd movements, people with packages or backpacks or other, odd details. So it's just, I find this topic fascinating. I know there are Kennedy researchers who make it their whole ambition to just understand this part. I believe a man named Vincent Palomara is one of the premier researchers in this area right now. So if Secret Service agents, particularly in the JFK assassination, is a topic that's of interest to you and you want to learn more, he may be a source that you might be interested in. This book is written by Lisa McCubbin, who's a journalist, and she actually also, I believe, worked with Clint Hill to tell his part of the story. So she's worked with a couple of different Secret Service agents. But Gerald Blaine is one who had White House detail Secret Service duty for 3 presidents, and his last service was JFK. And so he resigned shortly after the assassination. So he is the one writing this story. It says, a book 50 years in coming. The Kennedy Detail is a portrait of camaraderie and heartbreak, a true must-read story of heroism in its most complex and human form. So hopefully we get some honesty here. I don't know about you, but when I come into a book like this, I kind of feel skeptical that they're going to tell me anything that actually makes them look bad. It's like, are you really going to report on yourself? Are you going to tell us the truth about dropped opportunities or times when you have regrets? But we can hope, right? We can hope that there is that. So what we are going to do is read a couple of paragraphs to move us toward Dallas and then get right into the Secret Service agents and their behavior and actions in those hours leading up to the assassination. So if you don't remember, this was a 2-day, 5-city trip to Dallas. And so Secret Service had been front-loaded with plans, but the normal person who did the planning for Secret Service and where they were going to be wasn't actually on this trip, I believe. So there's some unusual things about this trip. The other thing is Kennedy was trying to shore up support in Texas because his political success rested on gaining Texas in 1964 in the coming election that they were anticipating a year, unfortunately, following what turned out to be the assassination. But we are told Secret Service agents had been spread to the various cities in advance, arranging the seemingly endless logistics and details with the local police force for every venue and every motorcade in every city. Because the president was visiting so many cities in such a short amount of time, there was no way to transport the presidential limousine SS-100X and the Secret Service follow-up car to every location. The cars would not be used in Houston. So Pontius had arranged for Lincoln Town Car convertibles provided by the Ford Motor Company to transport the presidential party and the Secret Service agents in the motorcade that would meander through downtown Houston. So they have plans for how they're going to move through each city, and the final stop before Dallas was Fort Worth. So they had made it through San Antonio, they had made it through Houston, and their day was ending in Fort Worth. So they were going to Fort Worth, Dallas, and then they had plans to go to Austin that evening. Of course, that never happened, and they were going to conclude the trip at LBJ's ranch. Spread among 3 airplanes, the Secret Service agents were happy to have a brief chance to sit down. They had probably jogged the equivalent of 8 miles. With no food on the planes, they grabbed Cokes or water and tried not to focus on the blisters that were forming on their feet. In less than an hour, they'd be starting the same routine all over again in Houston. In Dallas, Wynn Lawson, Forrest Sorrells, and Dave Grant were in the conference room in Chief Curry's office at Dallas Police Headquarters, wrapping up final details with Curry, his deputy chiefs, and other command officers for the president's arrival the next day. Lawson diagrammed the motorcade on the blackboard, placing particular emphasis on the use of motorcycles. The presidential motorcade follows a set pattern that we've determined through plenty of experience, both good and bad, that allows us to keep the motorcade moving and intact while deterring people from reaching the president's car, Wynn explained. Sorrells and Grant handed out samples of all the identification that would be used, from the plastic pin-on badges to the colored lapel clips, with the exception of Secret Service and White House staff pins. For these, they passed around photos to be used by the command officers to show the police officers under their direction. You don't want any loose Secret Service pins floating around. Next, the Trade Mart went through the final check. Lawson and Grant explained the procedure for the identification of guests and officers at the luncheon. Because the Trade Mart had so many entrances, exits, and balconies, to properly secure it required 70 plainclothes officers. The Dallas Police Department was so strapped that Chief Curry had to borrow 50 men assigned to the Department of Public Safety and 15 men from the Sheriff's Office to fulfill the security requirements, but he'd come through with the numbers. The meeting was adjourned only after every detail of the president's visit had been discussed, and when Lawson was confident that every commander had confirmed his area of responsibility was sufficiently covered. So in this section, we see Secret Service overseeing these discussions. We see Chief Curry in the conversation highly aware. We see at least the leaders of the groups getting a view of what the various badges would look like. And we get the sense that Dallas PD is a bit stretched, that they're having to borrow from the DPS, which would be, I think, state officials, and then sheriffs in order to fulfill security requirements at the Trade Mart, which is where the lunch was going to be. That's where the Kennedys were headed when they instead diverted to Parkland Hospital. So those are the things that I observe in this passage, is just that we get a little flavor of Dallas PD being a bit overtaxed, but seeming to come through, seeming to be okay. Let's keep reading. The sun was low in the sky and a strong wind was blowing across the flat open plain when Air Force One touched down in Houston. As in San Antonio, the press plane and Lyndon Johnson's plane were already on the ground. 10,000 cheering people greeted Mrs. Kennedy and the president at Houston International Airport, far more than had been expected. President Kennedy knew that Houston and the surrounding Harris County had gone for Nixon in the 1960 election. So when he looked out the window and saw the size of the crowd, he was elated. Houston advance agent Ron Pontius was the man on the ground, directing the shift agents to their assigned places. Now that it was nearly 5 o'clock, the 4 p.m. to midnight shift would take over protective duties and the motorcade under the direction of a man named Stuart Stout. The agents fully expected that the president would dive into the screaming mayhem to shake as many hands as possible. And that is exactly what happened. The president's car for the Houston stop was a standard white Lincoln convertible, so Mrs. Kennedy climbed into the back seat between the president and Governor Connell. Bill Greer drove, with Agent Roy Kellerman in the right front passenger seat. I believe both men were in the president's car in the Dallas motorcade as well. The Secret Service follow-up car created a challenge for the Secret Service agents since it too was a leased convertible. With no running boards, the agents would have to straddle the sides of the open-top car when the motorcade was moving at high speeds, then jump off and jog alongside the president's car when the procession slowed down. It was not ideal, but with the tight time schedule between stops, there had been no way to transport SS-100X and the Secret Service follow-up car to every stop. And while the president's detail shifts had rotated, Clint Hill, once again, as Mrs. Kennedy's special agent in charge, worked the motorcade, and Paul Landis was transported ahead to the next venue. What it's talking about with the running boards, there are photos of this in the Dallas motorcade. You can see them on the president's car and on the car behind. So on the president's car, there was a handle and a little ledge where your feet could go. It was specially made so that agents could stand on either corner of the president's vehicle and be safe and yet close in the event of any danger. And then on the follow car, they had running boards where they would hold onto the side and just stand alongside, and we have photos of that as well. But that's what they're talking about. They didn't have that, so they're like straddling the side of the car and then having to kind of jangle themselves off if they need to jog, which they do sometimes when the motorcade slows down. On the way from the airport to the Rice Hotel, the crowds were thick at times, often 10 to 12 people deep. Traffic was backed up for miles throughout the city. At certain strategic points along the route, anti-Kennedy groups held up banners and posters that reminded the president, despite the huge numbers of smiling spectators, that this was Republican country. The small numbers of protesters were far outnumbered by the enthusiastic yells and cheers of supporters who had come to catch a glimpse of America's royal couple. At the Rice Hotel, they were shown to a suite that had been redecorated especially for the president and Mrs. Kennedy's arrival. They wouldn't spend the night, but would simply use the room to change clothes and have a private meal together before their evening functions. Even though dinner would be served at the function, the Kennedys would be seated at the head table with social duties, and experience had taught them it was always better to eat a meal prior to these kinds of events. Yeah, you would learn these sort of little tricks of the trade if you were in this business where I know I'm going to be on the whole time. I don't want to be sitting there gnawing on a steak right when somebody says something that I'm supposed to laugh at. I don't want to be sitting there cutting up things or trying to butter my roll and not able to pay attention to the events that I'm there for. So it makes sense that they would have sort of like a show meal at the event, but eat beforehand. Meanwhile, Secret Service agents were posted around the hotel, observing every passerby and hotel worker with no time for food or drinks. When the President and Mrs. Kennedy were ready to head downstairs to the grand ballroom, Clint Hill and Roy Kellerman were waiting outside the door of the suite. Jackie looked breathtaking. She had changed into a long-sleeved black cut velvet dress and had a 3-strand string of pearls around her neck. Her hair, which had been windblown after the 2 long motorcades, was now perfectly coiffed. The president had been informed that the Albert Thomas banquet was not black tie, so he had merely changed into a different suit with a clean shirt and a new tie. As the president and his wife walked down the hill toward the elevator, he guided her with his arm on her elbow. Clint Hill, walking a few paces behind, thought to himself how nice it was that she had come on this trip. It was good for her to take an interest in her husband's campaign, and clearly they were enjoying their time together. A mariachi band was playing as the President and Mrs. Kennedy entered the event. The crowd seemed stunned that the President had actually shown up for their fundraiser. President Kennedy made a few brief remarks and then welcomed his most popular asset to the platform. In order that my words will be even clearer to you, I am going to ask my wife to say a few words to you also. The room erupted into cheers as Mrs. Kennedy walked to the podium. She didn't enjoy speaking in public, but you'd never know it. She smiled graciously and without any note cards, proceeded to address the crowd in fluent Spanish. Her command of the language was classical, but the mostly Mexican-American crowd loved it. Ole, they shouted. Ole, viva Jackie, viva President Kennedy. Meanwhile, the Secret Service agents scrambled to escort President and Mrs. Kennedy and Vice President and Mrs. Johnson to the cars waiting outside. The motorcade wound through the city to Sam Houston Coliseum. At the Coliseum, 3,500 people were seated at long dining tables, facing a large stage at one end. Against the backdrop of the stage, a large American flag hung on one side of the podium with the Texas flag proudly displayed on the other. Always Texas. I'm from Texas, if you don't know. And so, yeah, we are, absurdly proud of our state. But also, I will say, we've done some traveling back in earlier years of our life. And Texas seems to be one of the only states that people abroad know where it is and know what it is. People in other languages will say, Texas, cowboys, yeah. So Texas has a unique place, I think, in America and in the world. There were more receiving lines and speeches. Despite the grueling day he had had, the president appeared at the podium looking energetic and enthusiastic. At one point, he addressed the crowd. Reading from his notes, he said, "Next month, when the United States of America fires the largest booster in the history of the world into space, for the first time giving us the lead, fires the largest payload into space, giving us the lead." Realizing the gaffe he had just made, saying payroll instead of payload, he paused, looked down at his notes, and quickly recovered with his signature humor. Trying not to smile, he added, "It will be the largest payroll, too." The audience burst into laughter, and he laughed right along with them. They had caught an unexpected glimpse into the president's sharp wit. It was the best line of the night. Finally, at 9:30 p.m., the presidential party excused themselves and piled into the now familiar cars for their 5th motorcade of the day. The advance agent could see the weariness in Mrs. Kennedy's eyes. Pontius had conducted advances for Jackie's trip to London, Athens, and Rome in June of 1961. Ron Pontius knew Mrs. Kennedy. He knew the look of exhaustion, and as a motorcade wound back up at Houston International Airport, Pontius had no doubt that Mrs. Kennedy was feeling exhausted and exasperated. As far as Houston had gone, despite the hostility, fortunately everything had worked out fine. As tough as it had been on them, though, they realized that the shift agents had had the most grueling jobs that day. They'd been in those shoes plenty of times too. It had been a team effort, and everybody deserved to feel great about how successful the trip had been. In Dallas, after the final meeting with law enforcement, Lawson and Sorrells had met driver agents George Hickey and Sam Kinney at Love Field, where they were arriving from San Antonio on the Special Air Force C-130 with the president's car and the Secret Service follow-up car. Kenny and Hickey unloaded the vehicles and then drove them to the basement of the airport terminal, where they were secured by a police guard overnight. Hickey and Kenny would relieve the guard early the next morning. Everything is being made ready at the Trade Mart. I'm not going to get into that, but tables are being set. Things are being arranged. Security is being prepared for meeting the president there for lunch, where Kennedy would speak. Meanwhile, Air Force One, the press plane, and LBJ's plane were on their way to the final stop of the day, Carswell Air Force Base on the outskirts of Fort Worth. For everybody except the Secret Service agents, the day's work was done. The mood on Air Force One was jubilant, but everyone was exhausted. Aboard the press plane, cocktails were being consumed at a fast and furious rate. There was no food aboard, but drinks were still plentiful, and the atmosphere turned into a party. The Secret Service agents still had responsibilities once they landed in Fort Worth, so for them, Cokes and coffee were the drinks of choice. They weren't allowed to drink while on duty, and none of them would ever risk losing their jobs for the small pleasure of a beer, even after such a grueling day. Winding down for them would have to wait. More than drinks, they craved food. The agents hadn't eaten all day and were starving. Emory Roberts' shift, the 8 a.m. to 4 p.m. shift, had reported to the White House at 7:15 a.m., so when the planes landed around 11 p.m., with the 1-hour time difference, they had been on duty for 16 hours straight, with at least another hour to go to handle the arrival at Carswell. Clint Hill and Paul Landis, as the only two agents protecting the First Lady on the trip, had also been working the entire day without a break. UPI reporter Merriman Smith had traveled with the Kennedy detail agents for the past 3 years and was conscious that they'd work all day without eating a thing and without complaint. He had found out that the Fort Worth Press Club was staying open late for the White House reporters and mentioned it to a few of the Secret Service agents. "There's always a buffet at these things," he said, "and better yet, it's free. You guys are welcome to join us. There won't be anything else open this late." The 3 airplanes landed in quick succession at Carswell Air Force Base, with Air Force One the last to arrive at 11:07 p.m. This would be on November 21st, 1963, the night before the assassination. Because a visit by a sitting president was such a rare occurrence, the base had opened its gates to the public, and waiting there to greet President and Mrs. Kennedy were no less than 6,000 people. The rain-drenched crowd screamed with hysteria as the all-American couple disembarked. Roberts' men, who were Jack Reddy, Tim McIntyre, Don Lawton, and PRS agent Glenn Bennett, scanned the crowd as the incessant flashing of the press photographers' huge flashbulbs blinded their tired eyes. This, of course, points out the difficulty of the role of Secret Service, not just the hours, not just the lack of food, not just the lack of being able to let your hair down for a minute, constantly on duty. But then on top of that, you've got the battle of it's nighttime, it's rainy, and just imagine it, the bright flash bulbs here, there, you're looking here, and then all of a sudden you're blinded. You can't even scan the crowd. That would be a difficult job to do. When the Kennedys finally climbed into the car and the motorcade departed, the day shift was finally off duty. Stuart Stout's 4 p.m. to midnight shift handled the motorcade from Carswell into Fort Worth, again in leased convertibles, because the official presidential vehicles had been sent on to Dallas. But since it was raining, the convertible tops were closed. It was a small blessing because, from the agent's perspective, the only thing worse than a motorcade in open-top cars was a motorcade in open-top cars at night. And while the shift agents had rotated, Clint Hill and Roy Kellerman, as the special agents in charge, had been on duty nonstop the entire day, working arrivals, departures, motorcades, and every venue appearance. At the Hotel Texas, the midnight shift went on duty at 10 p.m. 2 secured the lobby, while Paul Burns and Bob Faison were stationed outside the presidential suite on the 8th floor. 2 others were standing post at the hotel entrance and had watched as more and more people jammed the streets outside the hotel, hoping to catch a glimpse of President and Mrs. Kennedy. By the time the presidential motorcade arrived at 11:45 p.m., there had to be 4,000 people surrounding the old hotel's entrance. The schedule called for the Kennedys to go straight to the hotel. For heaven's sake, it was nearly midnight. But the president couldn't ignore the thousands who had waited in the rainy night to welcome him to Fort Worth. Without a word to the agents, President Kennedy bolted toward the crowd and began shaking hands, with Jackie following dutifully behind. Once again, the agents scrambled to cover them. The Hotel Texas, a historic red brick hotel, had been elegant in its day, but had long since lost its luster. The halls were dark and musty, and while window air conditioners had been installed, the hotel was at the time in desperate need of updating. In an attempt to spruce up the presidential suite for the President and Mrs. Kennedy, local Fort Worth supporters had gone to great lengths to add luxurious furniture and expensive works of art that they felt suited Jackie's taste. By the time the President and Jackie retired to their suite, it was after midnight, though, and in reality, the only thing they truly cared about was falling into a comfortable bed. Maybe we'll hear about it in a minute, but I do understand that they really enjoyed looking at the artwork the next morning. And I believe he called the woman who was responsible for having put the art collection together to specially thank her that morning. So that would have been a really meaningful call to have received. I mean, especially in light of what would happen later that day. But can you imagine getting that call from the President? Well, now we're getting to the part of the reading that I hope will deal with this part honestly. Reports are that many Secret Service agents stayed out until the hours of between 2 and 5 a.m. drinking heavily. And particularly, I think, at a club that was affiliated with Jack Ruby. Is that right? Maybe I have that detail wrong, but hopefully we'll find out in this reading. Clint Hill and Roy Kellerman bid them goodnight, and when the door closed, the midnight shift was now in charge of their protection, leaving the day and evening shifts finally off duty. In about 8 hours, they'd start the whole routine all over again. The supervising agents, Kellerman, Stout, and Roberts, retired immediately to their rooms. They were all in their mid to late 40s and had learned that as they aged, more sleep was required to feel alert the next day. I can say a hearty amen to that. I missed multiple hours of sleep in the middle of the night a few nights ago, and I am still feeling it. I didn't want to get up this morning. But when your senses are on high alert and your adrenaline is pumping so hard for so long, often sleep does not come easily. The winding down process is different for everybody, but for many of the shift agents, the shared camaraderie of the day's events was a way to work out the tension so they could finally fall asleep. They were young, most in their mid-20s to early 30s, and fortunately their bodies were resilient. There had been plenty of days on end even, in which they had worked 18 or 20 hours, had 4 hours of sleep, and had woken up revitalized and able to do their job with ease. Somehow your body got used to it. It's like college days. Special Agent Dave Grant had driven over from Dallas to brief the agents who would be working at the Trade Mart because he would have little chance to give instructions after they arrived in Dallas the next day. While standing in the lobby with some of the other agents, a couple of reporters reminded them of the invitation to the press club. Afternoon shift agent Sullivan declined, as did McIntyre, the newest agent on the day shift. They just wanted sleep. But for the other 8 agents who had been on duty all day without a meal, the idea of a free buffet was something they couldn't just pass up. Unfortunately, by the time Dave Grant, Clint Hill, Andy Berger, Dick Johnson, Paul Landis, Ernie Olson, Don Lawton, Jack Reddy, and PRS agent Glenn Bennett got to the club, all the food was gone. Nothing else was open at that time of the night. "Sorry about that," Merriman Smith said to the dejected-looking agents. "I bet the barman can scrounge up some peanuts or pretzels if you want to stay for a drink." Oh yeah, after 18 hours of working and constant adrenaline, give me some peanuts and I'll be just fine. It was better than nothing. A beer or a scotch and soda would at least wash down the peanuts and hopefully help them relax enough so that sleep would come easily. Every Kennedy detail agent knew there was absolutely no drinking while on duty, but there were no off-duty alcohol policies that were emphasized by management. The agent's character and ability to perform were constantly being monitored, and none of them would take the risk of overindulging in alcohol. Like anybody with a stressful job, a beer or two at the end of a long day was simply a way to unwind. On the White House detail, the reality was that there was no start or stop time for the agents. The agents stuck to themselves and shared a few laughs about the day's hectic events while Dave filled them in on what to expect the next day in Dallas. Everybody had a beer or two, or a mixed drink, but with no food around, they all decided to leave. A few of the White House press corps had heard about an after-hours place a few blocks away called the Cellar, which was a beatnik type of coffee shop where scantily clad waitresses doubled as singers. The Cellar didn't serve alcohol, but perhaps they could get a sandwich. I feel like all of this is being described in the most utmost of terms, but even still, it's like scantily clad waitresses doubled as singers. They call it a coffee shop. What I've heard is that they were out drinking all hours of the night. The Cellar supposedly didn't serve alcohol, though. So if you know about that, leave comments below. I'd love to have that confirmed. I didn't realize that that was the case. It continues, unfortunately, the Cellar didn't have much in the way of food either. So after a couple glasses of fruit juice, the group returned to the hotel. Paul Landis had struck up a conversation with an attractive female reporter and a Fort Worth police officer and wound up not leaving until about 5 a.m. By this time, the warm feeling he had had from the scotch and soda several hours earlier had worn off, and when he got to his room, he fell dead asleep. For the agents standing watch on the midnight shift, it was a very unusual night. Everybody seemed to be wound up after the hectic and eventful day. Members of the press and the presidential staff were coming and going all night. At least the activity helped fight the fatigue of the agents standing post in the musty hotel. There were 4 posts set up at the hotel, and the posts were rotated every half hour to keep the agents fresh. The rotation also allowed for each man to have a half-hour break to get a cup of coffee or some fresh air. The midnight shift agents had been told about the quirky coffee shop called the Cellar just a few blocks away, and as that was the only place open for coffee at this time of night, several of them walked down there during their breaks to check it out. The fresh night air felt good after standing in the stuffy old hotel, and though a cup of coffee would have been a great pick-me-up, as soon as they saw the 60-cent per cup price tag, they turned right back around. Who in their right mind would pay 60 cents for a cup of coffee? In Dallas, Wynn Lawson had double-checked the security of the Trade Mart one more time and made sure the bomb dogs had completed a sniff down. By the time he finally got back to the Sheraton Dallas, it was 11:30 p.m. Sleep was slow in coming as he kept going over everything in his mind. This was always a problem when you were the lead advance agent on a presidential visit. If there were ever an incident, you sure didn't want it to happen on your watch. Have you ever had that? So we do some backpacking as a family, and I'm usually the one that puts together the spreadsheet with all the plans of everything we have to pack and all of that. And there's a lot to make sure every person's pack has everything they're going to need for the length of the trip. And so it actually is not, of course, to this level of intensity, but it is like if we get out into the woods and we don't have our emergency kit, if we get out into the woods and one kid doesn't have any of his socks, if we get out into the woods and we forgot one whole lunch, those things will hit hard because you have no resources out in the woods. So I have felt that sense of laying in bed. I should be going to sleep. We're going to be getting up in 3 hours and 45 minutes and I've got to make a drive. And yet I can't go to sleep because my mind is racing, just making sure, did I do all the things? Has everything gotten in the place that it needs to be? So I know that level of anxiety. It's like a healthy anxiety in a sense that keeps us focused on the work that has to be done and on the tasks that must be done in order for something to be successful. But it is hard to go to sleep at a moment like that. Well, we're down to the final bit, and I have to say I am disappointed with this description. So if you know of a better one, perhaps we'll do another read-through like this at some point, and we can get a different read-through that gives what I've heard is a more accurate view. But this makes it sound like they did a little drinking earlier in the night, like around midnight, but then by the time you got to the 1 a.m. to 5 a.m. hours, that they went to a place called the Cellar that didn't even serve alcohol, and they're just drinking fruit juice and coffee. That's a totally different picture than what I've had. Now, scantily clad waitresses and staying up to talk to a beautiful reporter, that's in line with what I've heard, but what I've heard has been way more like they were out drinking until late in the night. So I just wonder which thing is true. I wonder if they brought their own alcohol mixed with the fruit juices. I'm just left to wonder a lot of things. And if you can fill in the gaps in the comments, I would welcome that, because I'm definitely far from an expert and we all have things we need to learn. And so that's the goal of this series. Well, we do get to part 3, I will read just a smidge of getting to that day. The title of this chapter is The Final Hours, Friday, November 22nd, 1963. The rain had continued off and on throughout the night, but as dawn broke in Fort Worth, patches of white in the gray sky seemed to tease that the sun might actually break through. Despite the inclement weather, thousands of people had gathered in the parking lot outside the Hotel Texas, where the president was scheduled to make a few remarks before the Chamber of Commerce breakfast. Can you feel the pace of this that would be required on the president and Mrs. Kennedy, that they had events all day the day before? They had left the White House, went to San Antonio, went to Houston, got on a plane, got to Fort Worth, still went out and met people at midnight. Then they're up early. He wants to go speak to the crowd before they go to the breakfast. This is so much activity. Like the level of intensity, we've had the contrast in our last 2 presidents, actually. People criticized President Biden for his sort of slow-moving, they called it the basement campaign, where he just wasn't very visible. Now, some of that was due to COVID, but he maintained sort of a slow posture to go in before the public throughout his presidency, versus Trump, who's like a Tasmanian devil of activity that's constantly having press conferences and releasing this and saying that, and sure, I'll talk to the reporters, and just a totally different style. And you see Kennedy being way more towards this side. I don't mean in character, so don't say I'm saying that. I'm just saying when you look at frenetic activity, Kennedy is way more toward the Trumpian style of just being in among the people, getting jazzed and invigorated by, hey, there's a crowd, let's go meet with them. Hey, there's this activity, we're going to bring it all. We're going to bring our humor, our wit, we're going to bring our speaking style, my whole brain to the task. Like Kennedy just brought himself over and over again to the people in these activities. It's remarkable to observe. Well, we see the men, they are all talking about what they're going to do. They're making plans, talking about how everybody loved Kennedy. We get a look at Roy Kellerman, and I want to focus here before we close out. It was shortly before 9 a.m. when President Kennedy emerged from the front doors of the hotel, flanked by Emory Roberts and Roy Kellerman. I don't want to pause too many times, but remember, President Kennedy has already gotten up, enjoyed some time with Mrs. Kennedy looking at the artwork, called the woman who arranged it all. Like, he just didn't stop. 48-year-old Roy Kellerman was one of the most experienced agents on the White House detail. He was in his 23rd year with the Secret Service, having worked his way up from a shift agent to his current position as Assistant Special Agent in Charge. He had served under Presidents Roosevelt, Truman, Eisenhower, and now Kennedy, and had earned his role in the top echelon of Secret Service ranks through dedication and proven loyalty. In the past 2 decades, he had spent more time with heads of state than with his own daughters, who he could hardly believe were already 17 and 20. That would definitely be a difficult role of Secret Service, to know that you're basically living in someone else's world for most of the time. You're giving crazy amounts of your day, your energy, your brain power toward the protection of the president and his family, and less able to give focus on your own family. They meet up. The president walked across the street, and the agents created an envelope around him. Vice President Johnson, Governor Connell, Senator Yarborough, and several congressmen came trotting along behind, trying to show a united front. But as the crowd of several thousand erupted into a cheer, it was clear that the only person they had come to see was John F. Kennedy. We have a picture of this morning. I'll just go ahead and show y'all. First, we get Jerry Blaine, who's the author of this book. They're in front of the Texas Hotel, or the Hotel Texas there. And then we have these famous shots. I'll actually put up these shots for you guys in full so you can see them. But the famous shots of, it says, Secret Service agents scanning the crowd and open windows as President Kennedy speaks outside the Hotel Texas just hours before his assassination. And then another special agent keeping a watchful eye on the crowd as JFK speaks outside the Hotel Texas with Governor Connell, Vice President Johnson, and other dignitaries behind him. The Secret Service agents scanned the mass of humanity that seemed to be closing in like a giant swarm. They looked at hands and faces for quick movements or quizzical looks, anything that seemed out of place. Their eyes gazed across the sea of people on the ground and up to the open windows in the buildings surrounding the lot. In the midst of the mayhem, the agents were calm, but ready to react in a millisecond if anything got out of hand. It was no secret that there were plenty of people in Texas who hated everything President Kennedy stood for. As the president stepped up to the podium, the agents signaled each other with their eyes or a nod of their head to take notice of a man with his hands in his coat pockets, or a woman who looked like she might lunge toward the stage, and constantly they scanned the windows overhead. If President Kennedy had any fear at all, he sure didn't show it. "There are no faint hearts in Fort Worth," he announced into the microphone, and the crowd cheered. But before he could speak again, a woman yelled out, "Where's Jackie?" President Kennedy got that look on his face he had when creating a clever, humorous response, and after the briefest hesitation, he answered, "Mrs. Kennedy is organizing herself." He paused for effect, and then trying to hold back a smile, he added, "It takes her a little longer." The crowd broke into simultaneous laughter. Now grinning, he added the punch. "But of course, she looks better than we do when she does it." The crowd loved it. They loved him. He kept his remarks brief, just long enough to make the people feel like the long wait in the drizzle had been worthwhile. Then he stepped down from the podium and returned to the hotel for the formal breakfast. We will go ahead and end our discussion there. Part of the reason why is that we will get into the movement of Secret Service at the time of the assassination in our next couple of readings. But this one gets us through the Texas trip right up to the time when they get on the plane to head to Dallas for that fateful event of the assassination. Next time, we are going to be getting into the actual assassination, and we are going to do it through this book, The Act of Treason by Mark North. So come back for that. I'm looking forward to getting into Mark North's work. I don't have any idea what to expect really, but we're going to read about the actual assassination. We're finally there, you guys. We finally have made it. So kudos to us and thank you to you for going through the preparatory work with me so that we can get to this moment. And then from here on after, we are going to be reading about the assassination, and then we are going to look at play by play the investigation that unrolled, including the Warren Commission and all the rest. So come back for that next time. I look forward to that with you. Let me know in the comments what you noticed about the Secret Service agents. Particularly, let me know what you know, because I do feel like now that I read this section, I do feel that we got a very whitewashed look. I mean, honestly, in some ways, they're telling what's true. That Secret Service agents do an incredible job, that they work long hours, that they sacrifice their own families, that they sacrifice their own body and health for the sake of the president and his family. And so a huge thanks, a huge debt of gratitude to those men and women. However, I do feel that this was a whitewashed look, and I wonder if you're feeling the same. So let me know in the comments. Let me know what resources you have, podcasts, videos, and books that would give a better look at the actual events of those hours leading up to the morning of the assassination. So I look forward to that in the comments. We'll see you soon. Have a great day. Bye.